Over time, he realized something important. Growth always looks like change from the outside. Staying true did not mean staying the same. It meant staying aligned with his values. Even as his path evolved, he began writing more of his own music, letting his experiences guide the sound. The pieces were not flashy. They were thoughtful, shaped by real moments and emotions. Playing them felt like speaking honestly, without explanation. When he shared this music, reactions were mixed. Some loved it. Others preferred the older style. He accepted both. He knew now that not everyone would walk the same part of the journey with him. One evening, after a long performance, he sat alone, listening to the quiet settle around him. He thought about the boy he once was, afraid to play in public. He felt grateful for the criticism that forced him to grow, for the applause that reminded him why he started. He understood that success was not a straight line. It moved forward, paused, and sometimes stepped back. What mattered was continuing with intention in the following weeks. He became more selective, choosing moments that felt meaningful rather than loud. He focused on building something steady instead of chasing quick attention. People who truly listened stayed. Others drifted away, and that was okay. One afternoon, a young performer approached him quietly after a set. The person thanked him for showing that it was possible to keep going despite doubt. That moment meant more than any applause. He realized then that his journey was no longer just his own. It had become an example, even if a small one. As he walked home that day, he felt calm. Not because everything was perfect, but because he trusted himself. The fear that once controlled him had softened into awareness. The road ahead was still uncertain. There would be new challenges, new criticism, and new lessons. But he was ready. He placed his instrument down gently. Knowing tomorrow would bring another chance to grow, the applause might fade and opinions might change. But the strength he built would remain, and that was enough to keep him moving forward. One honest note at a time. Time continued to move forward, quietly but steadily. He no longer counted his progress in days or weeks. Instead, he measured it in moments. Moments when music felt right. Moments when he felt calm in places that once filled him with fear. His life settled into a rhythm that felt natural. Practice in the mornings. Small performances scattered through the week. Long walks home with thoughts drifting freely. The rush he once chased had softened into something deeper. Purpose. People still recognized him now and then, but he no longer searched their faces for approval. A smile was welcome. Silence was acceptable. He had learned that meaning did not always come from reaction. There were quieter periods too. Weeks when opportunities slowed and crowds were smaller again. In the past, this would have scared him. Now, he saw it as part of the cycle. Growth was not always visible. Sometimes it happened quietly, beneath the surface. During one of these slower weeks, he spent more time reflecting. He thought about the many versions of himself that existed along the journey. The boy tapping rhythms on old objects, the teenagers shaking with fear on the street, the young man learning to stand firm while being watched. Each version mattered. None of them were wasted. He realized that criticism had not disappeared from his life. It had simply changed form. Now, it came as expectations, comparisons, and advice that was not always asked for. Learning to filter these voices became another lesson. He listened carefully, kept what was useful, and let the rest go. This skill took time, but it brought peace. One afternoon, while practicing alone, he noticed how different his playing felt. Not faster or louder, but clearer. Every note seemed to carry intention. He smiled softly, realizing how far his relationship with music had grown. Later that week, he returned to a familiar street where his journey had truly begun. The place looked the same, but he felt different standing there. He sat up slowly, taking in the surroundings. As he played, memories surfaced. The laughter, the doubt, the nights he went home feeling invisible. Instead of pain, these memories brought gratitude. They reminded him that strength often grows from discomfort. A small crowd gathered, not large, but attentive. He played without rushing, letting the moment unfold naturally. When the music ended, the applause came gently, without excitement or noise. It felt perfect. After packing up, he lingered for a moment, watching people move on with their lives. He understood then that his role was not to stop time, but to add something meaningful to it, even briefly, in the days that followed. He became more intentional with his energy. He said no more often. He chose rest without guilt. He protected the part of himself that loved music before anyone else noticed it. He also began writing down his thoughts. It's not for anyone else, but for himself. Reflections on fear, growth, and patience. These notes became reminders on days when doubt returned. Occasionally, someone would reach out to share how his music had helped them. These messages stayed with him longer than applause ever did. They felt real. He understood now that success was not about being seen by everyone. It was about being understood by a few. As seasons changed, he continued walking his path with quiet confidence. There was no dramatic ending waiting for him, and he did not need one. The journey itself had become the reward. He looked toward the future without urgency. Whatever came next would be faced with the same honesty that brought him this far. The criticism that once nearly stopped him had become a teacher. The applause that once felt distant had become a reminder, not a goal. When he thought about his story, he no longer focused on the struggle or the praise. He focused on the choice he made every day to keep going. And that choice, simple and steady, was what truly defined him. He picked up his instrument once more. Not for the crowd, not for approval, but for himself. The music began again, calm and confident, carrying forward a journey built on patience, resilience, and quiet belief. From the first note, he felt connected. The music flowed without effort. His fingers moved freely, guided by instinct rather than thought. People stopped faster than usual. The crowd grew larger than he expected. Some faces showed surprise. Others showed curiosity. A few even showed emotion. He noticed someone wiping their eyes quietly. That sight nearly broke his focus, but he stayed with the song. He let the moment happen. When he finished, the reaction was different this time. The applause was stronger, louder. People smiled openly. Some nodded in approval. Few stepped closer to thank him. He did not know what to say, so he simply smiled back. For the first time, the criticism felt distant. It did not disappear, but it lost its power. The voices that once told him to quit were no longer the loudest ones in his mind. That night, he walked home feeling lighter. The streets looked the same, but he felt different within them. He realized he had crossed an invisible line. He was no longer just surviving rejection. He was starting to earn respect. At home, he shared the experience quietly. His family listened closely. They still worried, but they could not ignore the change in his voice or the calm in his eyes. They saw that music was no longer hurting him. It was strengthening him. In the days that followed, opportunities began to appear in small ways. A local event asked him to play briefly. A nearby cafe mentioned live music. None of it promised money or fame, but it offered something just as important. A platform. He prepared carefully for each chance. He practiced more thoughtfully, paying attention to mood and flow. He imagined the audience, not as judges, but as people, looking for a moment of connection. The performances went well, not perfectly, but honestly. He made mistakes and recovered from them. He learned how to read a room and adjust. He learned when to push forward and when to slow down. The more he played, the more he understood that applause was not the goal. Connection was. When people felt something, applause followed naturally. There were still hard days. Days when crowds were small. Days when comments were sharp again. But those days no longer defined him. They were just part of the rhythm. He stood taller now, not because everyone believed in him, but because he believed in himself. The criticism that once crushed him had shaped him instead. It forced him to grow, to listen, and to refine his voice. As this part of his journey came to a close, he sensed that something bigger was ahead. Did not know exactly what it would be, but he felt ready. He packed his instrument after another long evening and paused for a moment, looking around at the familiar streets. These places had tested him. They had challenged him. And now they were beginning to give something back. He took a deep breath and walked forward. carrying not just his instrument, but the confidence he had built through every difficult step. The applause was no longer a dream. It was becoming a response to the journey he had survived. The change became clearer with each passing week. He was no longer just another person playing on the street. People began to recognize him. Some nodded when they passed. Others slowed down on purpose. A few arrived early, standing nearby before he even started, as if they were waiting for something familiar. He noticed these small signs and tried not to let them distract him. Fame was still far away, and he reminded himself how quickly attention could fade. What mattered more was staying grounded. He kept practicing the same way, focusing on honesty rather than perfection. One evening, he was invited to play at a small local gathering. It was nothing grand, just a simple setup, a modest crowd, and basic sound equipment. In the past, this kind of situation would have made him nervous. This time, he felt ready. As he stepped into the space, he saw faces filled with curiosity rather than doubt. Some people whispered to each other, likely wondering what to expect. He took a moment, breathed deeply, and began. The music filled the room slowly. It was softer than street noise, more controlled. Every note carried weight. The room grew quiet as people listened closely. He could feel their attention, not as pressure, but as connection. When he finished the final piece, the applause came naturally. It was not forced or polite. It was warm, genuine. He stood there for a moment, unsure how to respond. Then he smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. After that night, more small opportunities followed. Nothing dramatic. A local cafe? A neighborhood event? A recommendation passed quietly from one person to another. Each chance felt like a step forward, built on trust rather than hype. He still faced criticism from time to time. Not everyone liked his style. Some people compared him to others. Few questioned whether he could go further, but these opinions no longer defined him. He had learned how to listen without losing himself. His family watched these changes closely. They saw him come home tired but fulfilled. They noticed how he spoke with more calm and clarity, though they still worried about the future. They could no longer deny the growth they saw. One evening, they sat together in quiet conversation. No arguments, no pressure, just understanding. He explained what music meant to him, not as a dream of fame, but as a way of living honestly. For the first time, he felt truly heard at home. The streets that once felt unforgiving now felt like teachers. They had shown him how to handle rejection, patience, and resilience. He did not forget those early days, carried them with him as reminders of how far he had come. He also began noticing others like him. Young performers standing nervously with instruments, facing the same uncertainty he once felt. Sometimes, he stayed nearby, listening quietly, offering a nod or a small word of encouragement. He knew how much those gestures could matter. One afternoon, a familiar crowd gathered again at the same busy corner where he once felt invisible. He set up, played, and felt the rhythm settle naturally. The sound moved smoothly through the space. When he finished, the applause came stronger than ever. People clapped openly. Some cheered. Others simply smiled. It was a moment he had imagined many times, yet it felt different now. It was not overwhelming. It was peaceful. He realized then that the applause was not just for the music. It was for the journey behind it, the countless hours of practice, the nights of doubt, courage to return after being told to stop. As the crowd slowly dispersed, he packed his instrument carefully. A few people approached to thank him. One said his music helped them forget a hard day. Another said they felt inspired to keep chasing their own passion. Those words stayed with him. Walking home that evening, he felt a quiet sense of completion. Not an ending, but a closing of a chapter. He understood that success was not a single moment. It was a collection of choices made again and again. He knew challenges would continue. Music was never guaranteed. Crowds could change. Opportunities could fade. But he trusted himself now. He trusted his effort and his voice. The criticism that once broke him had shaped him instead. It taught him to listen carefully, improve patiently, and stand firmly in who he was. Without it, he might have quit too soon. He reached his home, placed his instrument down, and sat quietly for a moment. The noise of the day faded, leaving only calm. He felt thankful not for applause alone, but for the strength he had gained. His story was not about becoming famous overnight. It was about turning doubt into discipline, fear into focus, and criticism into growth. As he looked toward the future, he did not see a clear path. But he felt ready to walk it, one step at a time. The same way he had learned to play, slowly. Honestly, the young musician who once stood shaking on the street had changed. Not because the world became kinder, but because he became stronger. And every time the applause came now, it reminded him of one simple truth. Belief, when earned through effort, lasts far longer than noise. Life did not slow down after the applause. In many ways, it became busier. More people recognized him now, and with that came new expectations. Some wanted him to play the same pieces again and again. Others expected him to always sound perfect. He learned quickly that appreciation could also bring pressure. He tried not to let it change him. Each morning still began the same way. Simple routines, practice, quiet moments of focus. He reminded himself that music was not about pleasing everyone. It was about staying honest with himself. As opportunities slowly increased, he faced choices he had never faced before. Some invitations sounded exciting but felt rushed. Others promised exposure but offered little respect. He took time to think before saying yes. In the past, he would have accepted anything just to be heard. Now he understood the value of his effort. There were days when exhaustion caught up with him. Late nights, early mornings, and constant movement wore him down. His hands ached. His mind felt tired. On those days, doubt returned quietly, asking if this pace was worth it. Instead of ignoring those feelings, he listened. He rested when needed. He learned that pushing too hard could take away the joy he had worked so hard to protect. Balance became a new lesson. Not everyone celebrated his growth. Few familiar voices returned with new criticism. They said he had changed. They questioned whether he was still genuine. Hearing this hurt more than earlier insults. These were people who knew his journey. He struggled with that pain for a while. Late at night, he replayed conversations in his head, wondering if they were right. He questioned whether growth meant losing parts of himself. He began changing how he practiced, focused less on pleasing others and more on expressing himself. He experimented with sound, rhythm, and emotion. Some days were frustrating, but others felt freeing. Slowly, his music started to sound more like him. When he returned to the streets again, something had changed. The fear was still there, but it did not control him the same way. He played with more intention, letting emotion guide him instead of nerves. The crowd reactions stayed mixed, but he noticed a difference in himself. Even when people criticized him now, the words did not cut as deeply. He was learning how to stand in his own space without apologizing for it. He understood that not everyone would like his music, and that was okay. By the end of this phase of his journey, he had not gained fame or praise, but he had gained something quieter and stronger. He had learned how to face rejection without running from it. He was still struggling, still doubting, but he was also growing. He did not know it yet. But every harsh comment was shaping him. Every difficult performance was preparing him for something bigger. The applause had not come, but his determination was slowly becoming louder than the criticism. The days began to blur together as he kept moving forward. Even when progress felt slow, morning routines stayed the same, but inside, something was changing. He no longer woke up wondering if he should quit. Instead, he woke up thinking about how he could play better than yesterday. The question was no longer whether music belonged in his life, but how deeply he was willing to commit to it. He started paying attention to details he once ignored. The way his fingers moved across the strings, the timing between notes, the small pauses that gave music space to breathe. He practiced with patience now, not rushing through mistakes, but sitting with them until they made sense. Each correction felt like adding a brick to something solid he was slowly building. Public performances became more frequent. He no longer waited days or weeks between them. Even after long shifts helping at home or doing small jobs, he made time to go out and play. Some evenings were cold and tiring. Other nights were noisy and uncomfortable. Still, he showed up. Consistency became his quiet strength. The streets continued to test him. Some people still laughed. Others ignored him completely. A few stopped just long enough to shake their heads. But something surprising began to happen. The criticism no longer followed him home the same way. He still remembered the words, but they did not replay endlessly in his mind. He was learning to let them pass through instead of settle inside him. There were moments of deep loneliness. Standing alone in a crowd made him feel invisible at times. He watched groups of friends walk past, laughing and carefree, and wondered what it would be like to live without constantly fighting doubt. But then he would look down at his instrument and remind himself why he was there. Music was not easy, but it was honest. One afternoon, as he played near a busy corner, someone stopped longer than usual. The person did not clap or speak, just listened quietly from a distance. When the song ended, they nodded once and walked away. That simple gesture stayed with him all day. It was not praise, but it was recognition. Someone had truly heard him. Encouraged by moments like that, he began experimenting more boldly, changed tempos, mixed emotions, and allowed his mood to guide his playing. Some days the music sounded hopeful. Other days it carried sadness or frustration. He stopped hiding these feelings and let them flow naturally into each performance. At home, his family noticed the change. He spoke less about doubt and more about ideas. He practiced with purpose, not desperation. While they still worried, they could see that music was no longer just a dream he talked about. It was something he was actively shaping with effort and discipline. There were still arguments. Practical concerns did not disappear. Money was tight and time was limited. He understood their point of view, and sometimes it hurt, knowing he could not offer clear answers about the future. All he could say was that he was trying his best, and that music was teaching him more than fear ever did. Late nights became moments of reflection instead of frustration. He thought about how criticism once felt like an enemy. Now, it felt more like a mirror. It showed him where he needed to improve, where he needed to toughen up, and where he needed to trust himself more. One night, while practicing alone, he realized something important. He was no longer playing to prove people wrong. He was playing to express something true. That shift changed everything. The pressure lifted slightly, and the music felt lighter in his hands. When he returned to public spaces after that realization, his presence felt different. He stood straighter. His movements were calmer. Even when mistakes happened, he did not panic. He continued playing, trusting the flow instead of fighting it. The crowd reactions remained mixed, but the energy around him changed. People were more likely to pause. Some stayed longer. Few even smiled. These were small signs, but they mattered. They told him that growth was happening, even if slowly. There were setbacks, too. Days when nothing worked, and the criticism felt heavier again. Days when he went home feeling defeated. But the difference now was recovery. He bounced back faster. He no longer saw bad days as proof of failure, only as part of the process. He began to understand that every musician he admired had walked this same path. Rejection was not a sign to stop, it was a sign to refine. That understanding gave him strength on the hardest days. As weeks passed, his sound became more confident. It carried intention. It told a story without words. He was still far from where he wanted to be, but he was no longer lost. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the streetlights flickered on, he finished a performance and felt something new. Pride. Not the loud kind, but the quiet kind that comes from effort. He knew he had given his best in that moment, and that was enough. He packed up and walked home slowly, listening to the city around him. The same streets that once felt hostile now felt familiar. They had shaped him through discomfort and challenge. He did not know what the next step would be. He did not know when applause would come, or if it would come at all. But he knew one thing clearly. He was no longer the same person who once stood frozen with fear. He had grown through criticism instead of shrinking under it. This stage of his journey taught him resilience. It taught him patience. And most importantly, it taught him that belief does not always arrive from the outside. Sometimes, it has to be built quietly, one note at a time. The change did not arrive loudly, came quietly through routine and repetition. He kept showing up to the same streets, the same corners, the same open spaces where people gathered. The difference now was how he carried himself. He was calmer. He trusted his hands. He trusted the sound he had worked so hard to shape. One afternoon he chose a spot he had avoided for a long time. It was busy, loud, and full of people who did not hesitate to speak their minds. In the past, that place had given him some of his worst moments. Standing there again made his chest tighten, but he did not turn back. He took a breath and began to play. At first, the noise around him tried to swallow the music. Cars passed. People talked. Vendors called out to customers. But he stayed focused. He did not rush. He let the music move at its own pace, steady and clear. Slowly, the sound began to rise above the chaos. A few people noticed. One person stopped walking, then another. Someone leaned against a wall to listen. The crowd was still small, but it was real. He felt it immediately. This time, people were not just passing by. They were choosing to stay. His hands moved with confidence built from long nights of practice. Every note carried intention. He was no longer trying to impress. He was telling a story, one shaped by struggle, doubt, and patience. The music sounded fuller, deeper, and more honest than anything he had played before. There were still whispers in the crowd, some skeptical looks. Not everyone was convinced. But instead of letting that distract him, he leaned into the emotion. He played as if this moment mattered, because to him, it did. When the song ended, the silence felt heavy. For a brief second, he feared the worst. Then someone clapped. It's just one person at first, then another. Soon, the sound spread. It was not loud applause yet, but it was real. He lowered his head slightly, surprised and grateful. That moment stayed with him long after he packed up and went home. It was not a breakthrough, but it was proof. Proof that people could hear him when he played from a place of truth. That proof fueled him in the days that followed. Word began to spread slowly. Not in big ways, but in quiet ones. Someone told a friend. A shop owner asked him to play nearby more often. A passerby recognized him from another day. These small connections made the streets feel less lonely. With each performance, he grew bolder. He tried longer sets. He took more risks with his sound. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But even when it failed, he learned. Failure no longer embarrassed him the way it once did. There was one evening that felt different from the start. The sky was heavy with clouds, and the air felt charged. He almost stayed home, feeling tired and unsure. But something pushed him out the door. He returned to the same busy area, set up, and began to play. He grew up in a small Mexican neighborhood where mornings began with street noise instead of alarm clocks. Vendors shouted to sell fruit, buses groaned as they stopped, and music floated through the air from open windows. Some songs were old and slow, others loud and cheerful, but they all felt alive. Music was everywhere, even when money was not. His family lived simply. The house was small, with worn walls and uneven floors, but it was full of voices and stories. Life was not easy, yet it was honest. From a young age, he noticed how music changed people. A tired neighbor would smile when a familiar tune played. A long workday felt shorter when someone hummed along. He did not understand notes or rhythm at first, but he felt something strong inside him whenever he heard a melody. It felt like the music was speaking for him, saying things he did not know how to say out loud. There was no fancy instrument waiting for him. The first sounds he made came from tapping on old tables, empty cans, and broken objects lying around the house. He listened carefully to street performers and local musicians copying their movements with quiet focus. Sometimes he would stop walking just to watch someone play, memorizing their hands and posture. He did not ask questions. He just observed and practiced later, alone. His family noticed his interest, but did not think much of it at first. In their world, children were expected to study, help at home, and find steady work later. Music was something you enjoyed after work, not something you chased. When he spoke about wanting to play music, the response was usually kind, but unsure. People smiled, patted his shoulder, and said things like, "That's nice." Before changing the subject, at school he was quiet. He did not stand out in class, and he was not the best student. But during breaks, he was different. He would tap rhythms on desks or hum tunes under his breath. Some classmates laughed, others ignored him. A few told him to stop, saying it was annoying. He stopped doing it around them, but the music never stopped in his head. One day, he found an old instrument that someone had thrown away. It was scratched and damaged, missing parts, but to him it looked beautiful. He carried it home like it was something precious. That night, he stayed awake, trying to make sense of it. The sounds were rough and uneven, but they were his. Each noise felt like a small victory. He practiced whenever he could. Early mornings, late nights, quiet moments when the house was empty. He did not have lessons or teachers. Mistakes were common, and progress was slow. Sometimes his fingers hurt, and sometimes nothing sounded right. Still, he kept going. Practice became his escape from worry and doubt. As time passed, his playing improved. He started to feel more confident, though he rarely showed it. When relatives visited, someone would ask him to play. He felt nervous every time. His heart would race, and his hands would shake. After he finished, the room would go quiet. A few people clapped politely. Others gave advice he did not ask for. Some said he should focus on school instead. Outside the house, life moved fast. People worked long hours and chased practical dreams. There was little space for big hopes, especially ones that did not promise money. He understood this, even as a child. Still, he could not imagine giving up music. It felt like giving up a part of himself. When he reached his teenage years, the pressure grew stronger. Friends started talking about jobs and future plans. Teachers spoke seriously about exams and responsibility. Music felt more distant from real life in the eyes of others. When he mentioned wanting to perform someday, people warned him about disappointment. They said many had tried and failed. He listened, but he did not stop dreaming. Instead, he started going out alone to places where people gathered. Markets, small parks, busy streets. He watched performers closely, noticing how they handled crowds and rejection. Some people walked past without listening. Others stopped for a moment and moved on. He realized that being seen was not easy, but it was necessary. At home, he struggled with self-doubt. There were nights when he wondered if everyone else was right. Maybe he was chasing something unrealistic. Maybe he was wasting time. These thoughts came quietly and stayed longer than he wanted. Still, every time he tried to imagine life without music, it felt empty. One evening, he sat alone, holding his instrument, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood fade into night. He thought about how far he had come, even without anyone truly believing in him yet. He realized that music was not just about applause or success. It was about staying true to what made him feel alive. He promised himself something simple. He would keep playing no matter what people said. He would learn, improve, and find his own voice. He did not know where this promise would lead, and he did not expect miracles. All he wanted was a chance to be heard. That quiet promise marked the beginning of his real journey. The world around him stayed the same, but inside, something shifted. He was no longer just a boy who liked music. He was someone willing to face doubt for the sake of his dream. And even though no one was applauding yet, his story had already begun. As time passed, his quiet promise began to shape his days. He did not suddenly become brave or confident. Fear still walked beside him, especially when he thought about playing in front of strangers. But the idea of staying silent felt worse than the fear of being judged. Little by little, he started stepping outside his comfort zone. He chose busy places where people passed without slowing down. Street corners near markets, sidewalks close to bus stops, and open spaces where sounds mixed together. These places were loud and unpredictable, but they felt honest. If he could survive there, he felt he could survive anywhere. The first few times he stood holding his instrument without playing. He watched people walk by, pretending to tune or adjust something, waiting for courage to arrive. When he finally started playing, his hands shook so badly, he almost stopped. The notes came out uneven, and his heart pounded in his ears. People barely noticed him at first. Some walked past without looking. Others glanced quickly and moved on. A few stared with curiosity, but did not stay. The silence between notes felt heavy, like every mistake was being noticed. Then the comments started coming. Some were quiet laughs. Others were words spoken loud enough for him to hear. People questioned why he was there. A few mocked his playing. One man told him he should find a real job. Another said street music was not meant for someone like him. Each comment felt like a small cut. They stayed in his mind longer than the notes he played. He went home that day feeling smaller than when he left. He replayed every mistake in his head, wondering why he thought this was a good idea. His family noticed his silence, but did not push him to talk. That night, he barely touched his instrument. The joy he once felt was replaced by doubt and embarrassment. For a few days, he stayed away from public places. He practiced alone again, in the safety of his room. The walls did not judge him, and the air felt kinder. Still, something felt unfinished. He realized that staying hidden would not protect him forever. If he wanted to grow, he would have to face the same streets again. When he returned, the reactions were not much better. Some days were worse. People criticized his style, his confidence, and even his background. They said his music sounded old-fashioned or strange. Others told him he would never succeed. He learned quickly that not everyone was kind. Many people spoke without caring how their words landed. There were moments when he wanted to argue back, to explain himself. But he stayed quiet. Music was the only answer he knew how to give. Even when his voice felt weak inside, he let his hands speak. Each performance became a test of patience rather than talent. Not all reactions were negative. Occasionally, someone would stop and listen for a few seconds. A child might sway to the sound. An older person might nod slowly before walking away. These moments were small, but they mattered. They reminded him that his music could reach someone, even if only briefly. Still, the negative voices were louder. Friends started hearing about his street performances and questioned him. Some laughed. Others warned him he was embarrassing himself. They told him people were talking. Each comment added weight to the pressure he already felt. At home, the conversations became harder. His family worried about his future. They asked how long he planned to keep chasing music. They did not forbid him, but their concern was clear. Bills needed to be paid. Life was not waiting for dreams to figure themselves out. He understood their fear, which made it harder to defend his passion. Late at night, he questioned himself more than ever. He wondered if talent was something you either had or didn't. Maybe effort was not enough. Maybe he was misreading his own abilities. These thoughts came quietly, sitting with him while the rest of the world slept. One night, after a particularly rough day, he almost put his instrument away for good. He stared at it for a long time, remembering how excited he once felt. He thought about all the comments, the laughter, the disappointment. His chest felt tight, and his hands felt heavy. Instead of giving up, he did something different. He listened. He listened to recordings of musicians he admired, not to compare himself, but to learn. He noticed their mistakes, their emotions, and their unique sounds. He realized none of them were perfect. What made them special was honesty, not approval.